What historical event sounds like a work of fiction? Story 1. The death of Ken Rex McElroy. He terrorized Skidmore, Missouri for decades, stalking, assaulting, murdering, and had two 14-year-olds who were his wives. He had an expensive attorney, so he was never charged. The law never helped the poor town. One day, the town gathered for a meeting on how to deal with McElroy. Details get a little vague here, but apparently someone alerted the room that McElroy was in the bar up the street. Quietly and calmly, everyone got up and walked over to the bar as McElroy got into his truck. Someone shot him in the back of the head. The town just went back to their business. When the witnesses, like the entire town, were questioned, everyone claimed they didn't see anything. No one has ever been arrested. There's a miniseries documentary about the incident called No One Saw a Thing. It's pretty interesting. Many of the residents believed the town is cursed because of a couple of unrelated unsolved murders and disappearances that happened over the years after McElroy's murder, and they stained the town's reputation. They also interview McElroy's wife and children, and you learn how the incident affected them. It's a pretty in-depth exploration of the gray morality of vigilantism, and how the consequences of actions can have long-lasting effects. This is some Nightmare on Elm Street stuff right here. I'm very impressed with the fact that the entire town agreed to say they saw nothing, and not one person cracked. That is definitely more like something out of a movie than any experience I've had with keeping secrets in reality. Story 2. In 1980, Lake Peigneur in Louisiana drained like a bathtub with the plug removed. Oil drillers on a rig in the lake had hit a mine shaft below. The rig, barges, a tugboat, and part of a nearby island got sucked into the largest man-made whirlpool ever. Imagine trying to drill a hole and messing up so bad you cause a river to flow backwards. Just walk away pretending nothing happened. Imagine being on the lake when this happened, or on that tugboat. You're just there minding your own business, and then suddenly you're being sucked into a whirlpool. This story is nightmare fuel. Story 3. In 1971, a teenage girl named Julianne Koepke was on a plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated in the air. She plummeted 3,000 meters, strapped to her seat, and landed in the Amazon rainforest. Her mom had been on the flight with her, and Julianne searched in vain for her mom, but Julianne was the sole survivor of the crash. She survived 11 days alone, treating her maggot-infested wounds with fuel and using tracking techniques her father had taught her before she found a boat that she used to make her way back to civilization. What an absolute legend! Her collarbone was broken. She spent days searching for water and subsequently traveling downstream in a river to find civilization with her clavicle sticking out of her skin. Eventually, she got her doctorate and became an ecologist. What an absolute friggin' champion. This story would make a very interesting book or film, especially considering she was a teenager when it happened. Teenage me definitely wouldn't have been as triumphant. Story 4. Operation Mincemeat. The Allied forces planted a dead body with fake battle plans to trick the Germans into thinking that the Allies were going to attack Sardinia, when they were in fact going to attack Sicily. They built an entire life for this dead, fake military man, dumped him in the ocean, and successfully distracted the Germans. I especially love that later in the war, the Germans recovered actual Allied plans but were so burned by mincemeat that they either disregarded them or assumed they were also faked and acted according to that assumption, twice. Actually, the whole intelligence/counterintelligence story of World War II is amazing. It definitely helped by how lousy the Nazis' intel attempts were. Story 5. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel in 1838 in which 4 shipwrecked survivors at the point of starvation choose to resort to cannibalism, so they kill the young cabin boy Richard Parker and eat him. In 1884, a ship called the Mignonette sank. 4 crew members survive. At the point of starvation, they killed and ate the youngest of them, Richard Parker. Didn't Poe also write a gag column to a newspaper claiming the first transatlantic hot air balloon flight, but it was years before the first actually happened, and when it did, he nailed the cities and the time damn near to a T? Was he a time traveler? This is an example of life imitating art to a degree that's quite disturbing. Even the name of the person they sacrificed is an exact match. Chilling. Story 6. Wojtek was a bear who fought Nazis in return for cigarettes and beer. He didn't die until 20 years after World War II. My favorite part about this story is that after the war he lived in a zoo. It was common for soldiers from the bear's company to come and visit and simply jump into the enclosure to play with him, much to the zookeeper's annoyance. I love that part, but my all-time favorite story is when he started moving crates with the soldiers. Bear see, bear do. Story 7. The CIA was researching psychic abilities for 30 years as a way to spy on the USSR. After 30 years, the program was terminated, and their conclusion was that psychic powers probably don't exist. The actual conclusion was that the evidence for remote viewing was unfalsifiable and therefore unprovable. Many of the more promising results were believed to be caused by information leakage, meaning that test subjects had prior knowledge about the subject they were asked about. They were unable to verify any of their results because of this, and even if the psychic abilities were real, they were unreliable at best. The code name for the project was Stargate. You can find the documents on the CIA website. They concluded they actually exist, but to keep from letting the masses and enemies know, they just played it off. Haha, yeah, you guys were totally right. No abilities here. Haha, none at all. OP didn't word the conclusion right. The CIA came to the conclusion that there was no reason to pursue the research, probably meaning that remote viewing wasn't better than the spyware they already have. Story 8. The battle for Castle Itter near the end of World War II saw US soldiers, French POWs, and the German army fighting on the same side to hold the castle against an SS tank division. To make it even weirder, the French prisoners included several prime ministers and a tennis star. A tennis star, 2 prime ministers, 2 French generals, a former SS officer, and Charles de Gaulle's sister. Someone get Tarantino on the phone. He needs to work on this. It certainly reads like an action movie. The tennis star vaulted the wall and evaded SS troops to deliver a dispatch to the reinforcement troops, and then proceeded to join with those forces to finish the battle. I'm fairly certain most of that was done in slow motion with dramatic music. Story 9. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the Antarctic expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. The stuff they went through was unbelievable. Their boat, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes. They were stranded on the floes for over a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took 3 boats, around 22 feet in length, across the Antarctic Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat. They missed reaching land by just a few miles at times. 2/3 of them got stranded on Elephant Island, surrounded by ice, while one of the boats went out in search of rescue. That boat made it through the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest places in the ocean. All but 3 of them got stranded with little food and water, while the 3 men who left became the first people to cross South Georgia on foot. They found civilization and rescued the men who came through the Drake Passage, but had to wait months until they could rescue those on Elephant Island. Every single person who came on the initial voyage survived, with the worst lasting consequence being a single foot amputation. This story is incredible. When you think about the lack of modern supplies and equipment, I highly recommend the book Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. Shackleton was an amazing leader. I've read several case studies about Shackleton's leadership style and how that led to a successful outcome and rescue despite being a failed expedition. I've listened to the audiobook version several times. There's no detail any of us can provide that does justice to how at every second these men face something trying to kill them or make surviving just that little bit harder. What amazing resilience these people showed. It's incredible that everyone on the voyage survived until the end. We can't even hope for that kind of outcome in fictional survival stories. Story 10. Apparently, death from laughter is an incredibly rare but a completely legit cause of death. In the 3rd century BCE, Chrysippus, a Greek Stoic philosopher, died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. And Chrysippus is not the only isolated case. Among the few other cases, a 5th century BCE Greek painter, Xerxes, is said to have died laughing at his painting of the goddess Aphrodite, for which an old woman had commissioned the painting had insisted on modeling. Also, Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt in 1st century BCE, claimed that her retainer died laughing at her husband's death. According to the linked Wikipedia article, the most recent case is that of Ole Benson, a Danish audiologist, who saw a funny scene in a comedy film and laughed so hard that his heart rate rose to a point where he had a fatal heart attack in 1989. From what I understand from reading up on this topic, it's not the act of laughing itself, but rather a fatal repercussion from a fit of laughter, such as cardiac arrest, asphyxiation, or aneurysm, which causes death. For instance, Ole Benson suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the terrible fit of laughter he had. It's possible that such was the case of Chrysippus and the others as well. I always thought of "I'm going to die laughing" as a hyperbole, and I myself use it quite liberally, but I guess every hyperbole has a grain of truth to it. Is a donkey eating figs really that funny? You had to be there. I can't be the only one who sees the irony of a Stoic philosopher dying of laughter. I bet he never saw that coming. Story 11. The Bone Wars. Two rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, were in a race for academic clout, so they both took off to places like the fossil beds of Montana and Utah to try and dig up as many dinosaurs as possible before the other guy. But they didn't stop there. They hired spies and saboteurs to impede the other's work, as well as trying to pass off sloppy or fake skeletons sometimes. The overwhelming majority of the iconic dinosaur types that we know were either first discovered or simply got a lot of new samples to work with and were made iconic by the amount of publicity they received. This includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus, some remains of a Tyrannosaurus, Apatosaurus, and many, many more. This is also where the Brontosaurus confusion comes from. One of the scientists had already discovered Apatosaurus. The other then discovered a new skeleton of the same dinosaur, but intentionally put a skull from a different species, Camarasaurus, onto the skeleton and tried to pass it off as a new species entirely, Brontosaurus. The fake was unveiled pretty quickly, but the name stuck. More recently, however, we have a lot more tools to distinguish smaller features from bones, and it was found that the skeleton that was originally passed off as a Brontosaurus is actually barely different enough to receive its own genus, and the name Brontosaurus was revived. I've always thought that this could make a fantastic show, especially if it includes dramatized flashbacks on how the dinosaurs in the skeletons died. It is worth noting that the Bone Wars have had a massive positive legacy on paleontology as a field, but left both scientists financially and socially ruined. An excellent bittersweet ending. There is a historical fiction book about a member of one of those parties. I think it's Dragon Teeth by Michael Crichton. Story 12. An English king named Ethelred, later called the Unready, took some troops to defend against a Viking invasion. The weather was bad, so a lot of Viking ships crashed as they were landing. Ethelred thought that it would be dishonorable to attack them as they were stumbling onto shore, so he kept his troops back until the Vikings had a chance to get together and form proper battle lines before he attacked them. The better prepared Vikings then won the fight and slaughtered a bunch of Ethelred's men, and he and the rest were forced to run away while the Vikings went around pillaging. Also, his sobriquet does not mean unready in the modern sense, as in unprepared, but rather ill-advised. Ethelred, the name, means well-advised, a hilarious pun. When you study history, you realize people are just people no matter the times. Fun thing, we have nuclear weapons and multiple ways to ruin the planet now. Story 13. Jean de Clisson, from 1300 to 1359, was married to a French nobleman who was beheaded for treason by the French king. Enraged, she sold their estate and purchased 3 black warships with red sails and became a pirate queen of the English Channel who targeted French ships. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany, and in her 13 years of piracy she would slaughter every member of a ship's crew except for one, so the last survivor could go back and tell the French king what had happened. I always wonder what pushes a person to abandon all their wealth that probably took generations to create and choose to live a lifestyle so far removed from where they used to be. Their husband getting beheaded. I'm sure she made the French king very quickly regret not executing her along with her husband. He gravely underestimated her fury. Story 14. Joshua Norton was just this random crazy guy from San Francisco who hated all the political nonsense that was going on at the time and figured he could do a better job at it himself. And thus, the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico was born. While he held no real power, the people liked him so much that they treated him like royalty anyways. Any currency issued under his name was treated like real money at many establishments. One day, he was arrested by a private security force because of his mental health, which enraged practically all of San Francisco. The police chief let him go because he had committed no crime, and Norton gave an imperial pardon to the guy who arrested him. After this incident, any police officer Norton passed would salute him. Another time, when a riot had formed and was getting pretty violent, Norton simply stood in front of the mob and calmly prayed, which managed to disperse the mob. And that's not even a fraction of the crazy stuff that he did. By the way, the 1870s US Census lists Joshua Norton as 50 years old, residing at 624 Commercial Street, and his occupation is listed as emperor. As far as I'm concerned, that's official government documentation that lists him as an emperor. His visits to certain restaurants led them to having plaques made that showed his imperial patronage, which increased their business. Story 15. During World War II, the US military researched the idea of dropping bombs filled with bats fitted with incendiary devices over Japan. A dental surgeon, Adams, who was an acquaintance of Eleanor Roosevelt, wrote the idea to her. He explained that bats would nest in the wooden buildings of Tokyo, and then the delayed timers on the incendiary devices would go off simultaneously and cause a massive fire. President Roosevelt approved the idea for study. The military found it would be highly effective compared to traditional firebombing campaigns. The only reason the plan wasn't implemented was because the bat bombs wouldn't have been combat ready until mid-1945, so they used atomic bombs instead. I highly recommend reading the Wikipedia article. There are so many crazy details. The entire thing reads as a surreal satirical article. I read about this in a book on secret weapons of World War II about 40 or so years ago. It mentioned that they put the bats into hibernation by using cooling trays, and the main problem was they did not unfreeze very well and plummeted to the ground and splat like frozen chunks of ice. They also had to add the miniature bombs to each bat. Think of thousands of small bats, each needing to have a small incendiary device attached, and then put into a bomb in trays. Poor little bats. Story 16. Sergeant Stubby. During World War I, a soldier found a stray dog when training on the Yale University campus and took a liking to him. The soldier snuck the dog onto the ship where he had to leave campus, and when the dog was found by the commanding officer, he was allowed to stay because he had learned how to salute. Stubby was injured a few times during the war, but he was useful with alerting his squad of surprise mustard gas attacks and gunshots before the human ear could even detect the sound. He also found and comforted wounded soldiers and caught a German soldier by the leg of his pants until American soldiers got to him, aka the bestest boy to ever live. Stubby is a true American hero. His remains are on display at a museum in DC, I believe, along with a pigeon from World War I named Cher Ami that saved some troops' lives. Story 17. A baboon who was employed to change rail signals. This is from the Wikipedia article after initial skepticism. The railway decided to officially employ Jack once his job competency was verified. The baboon was paid 20 cents a day and half a bottle of beer each week. It is widely reported that in his 9 years of employment with the railroad, Jack never made a mistake. Also from the article, an official investigation was initiated after a concerned member of the public reported that a baboon was observed changing railway signals at Uitenhage near Port Elizabeth. Can you imagine? Yes, in my mind, I'm imagining a drunk man on the train. He looks out the window, sees the baboon, looks back inside, suddenly shakes his head in disbelief, and looks out again. Sure enough, the baboon is right there. He looks at the bottle in his hand and begins to pour it out. Story 18. The East German balloon escape. In 1979, two families escaped East Germany to West Germany by a homemade hot air balloon. They had to fly twice. The first time they landed 200 yards short of the border. That story is absolutely insane, particularly the lengths they had to go through to get enough cloth without arousing suspicion. Talk about creative problem solving. It's amazing seeing the things people come up with when they really need to accomplish something. Story 19. In 2007, a paraglider got trapped in the updraft of two joining thunderstorms and was lifted to an altitude of 33,000 feet. She landed over 3 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning, and lack of oxygen. 33,000 feet is how high commercial planes fly, and extremely unlucky recreational paragliders. Story 20. I suggest that time the US government hooked listening equipment to a cat so we could spy on Russians, only to realize that cats don't follow commands, and then it got hit by a car. The cat was a Soviet spy and sacrificed itself so the Western pig dog capitalists couldn't spy on anything. Story 21. During World War I, the German Navy built a ship and painted it to look like a British ship called the RMS Carmania in order to infiltrate and destroy British convoys. On the ship's first outing, the first enemy it encountered was the real RMS Carmania, which promptly sank their fake one. I wonder what the reactions of the crews were. The British must have let out a bunch of confused WTFs, seeing a ship that looked exactly like theirs sailing up to them. And the Germans must have had a collective "oh crap" when they realized the first people they met were the dudes they were pretending to be. Story 22. Timothy Dexter was frequently given terrible business advice that would somehow pay off through a stroke of luck. He sold coal to Newcastle and made a profit. He became insanely wealthy, dressed in a strange manner, and acted weird in the company of incredibly wealthy elite that he had accidentally stumbled into. He spent a lot of time basically gaslighting his wife for his own amusement. For quite some time, he acted as if she had died and was a ghost, even introducing her to other people as his wife's ghost. He at one point even faked his own death so that he could see how people would react at his funeral. He also wrote a book that was a long-winded rant about everything that upset him. The book included no punctuation. He made a second edition with several pages of punctuation attached to the end that the reader could distribute as they saw fit. Basically, a real-life troll. My favorite story is the time he was told the Caribbean needed mittens, among other things. An expedition to Siberia passing through the area bought all the mittens. This guy lucked his way into wealth and then chose to just live life as a troll. That's kind of legendary. Story 23. A couple tried to commit insurance fraud and blew up an entire neighborhood in Indianapolis several years ago, killing 2, injuring several, and destroying over 30 houses. I remember hearing the boom from my house as if it was down the street. My friend lived a few homes down from them, and her house had to be rebuilt. For the longest time, the entrance to Richmond Hill, which is the neighborhood name, had 2 white markers out for the family that died, but not anymore. I was living out in Plainfield at the time, but I had several friends who lived within earshot of the explosion. I was awake and scrolling Facebook when it happened, and seeing their WTF was that posts popping up in real time as I watched the breaking news story was a bizarre experience. Story 24. 4 Auschwitz prisoners stole Nazi uniforms and a car. Only one of them was speaking German, so he was wearing the highest rank uniform. When they left the camp, they've encountered 2 patrols. The first patrol, with some high-ranked guy, just hailed to them. The second patrol, with 2 low-ranking soldiers, told them they can't leave because of orders, etc. The guy speaking German started screaming at them so loud and so realistically, they just said, "We're sorry, go ahead." I think the scarier part of this was that the Nazis were excellent bookkeepers and likely would have noticed that 4 prisoners had gone missing in fairly short order. Unlike other concentration camps in history, the Nazis used all the trappings of modernity to track their victims and murder them. Story 25. The Great Locust Swarm of 1875. At one point, the swarm was measured to be 100,000 square miles, and the locusts would eat everything in their path, even each other. The swarm was so thick that whenever it passed over an area, it would block out the sun. I remember this from one of the Little House on the Prairie books. It sounds absolutely terrifying. I'm still amazed that Americans screwed up the ecosystem of the US prairie so badly in the 1800s that they destroyed a whole locust species, nearly destroyed bison, and had the Dust Bowl happen. There's nothing like a biblical plague of locusts to show you just how badly you've treated the natural environment. Story 26. All of the assassination attempts on Castro. Only 7 are confirmed, but there are 638 supposed ones. Basically, they read like a comedy sketch. The CIA once placed a cool seashell rigged with explosives in a place where they thought Castro would see it, go, "Oh, cool shell," and pick it up. Despite this genius, he died of natural causes. Story 27. The Tamam Shud case. Shortly after World War II, a well-groomed, athletic man was found dead on an Australian beach. There was no apparent cause of death. It was impossible to identify the man. Some mysterious clues were found, among them a book with a cryptic message written into it. Later, they buried his corpse compassionately. Even later, it turned out that he might have been searching for a child he possibly fathered some years ago, and that the mother possibly had been a spy who had fallen in love with a spy from abroad, the unidentified man, who might have fathered said child with her. When he realized that the mother wouldn't be meeting him anymore, he would have poisoned himself on the beach, and since he was a spy, he used a poison that doesn't leave a trace. They also suspected he was a ballerina due to his build. He had on him a piece of gum and a snippet of a page from a book that, if I recall correctly, they found decades later with the mysterious writing on it. There's a whole ton of bizarre details, some of which don't even quite add up. It's my favorite unsolved mystery, quite honestly. Story 28. The Life of Harriet Tubman, one of the rare examples of someone who is a household name for being a badass, but was actually about 10 times more badass than people know about. Here are some things she did other than the Underground Railroad. 1. She financed and recruited for John Brown's Harper's Ferry slave revolt raid, and the only reason she didn't fight in person was she was bedridden with malaria. 2. During the Civil War, she joined the Union Army as a cook and nurse. 3. She somehow class shifted into a spy/scout and helped Union Union leaders plan raids into Confederate territory, and she assassinated several Confederates. 4. She rose in the ranks until she commanded a small raiding force of 300 Union troops from the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the second black U.S. Army unit ever. 5. Her command, Company C, 54th, raided southern plantations, slaughtered slave drivers, and freed captive slaves. 6. The Cumbie Ferry Raid, where the 54th freed 700 slaves. She was also in command of 3 Union frigates, and when a Confederate division was advancing on them, she fired broadsides from the 3 naval warships directly into the enemy troops. 7. She survived the war and immediately turned around and started fighting for women's suffrage. Why don't they teach this in school? That is insane. I have learned about the Underground Railroad, but not the rest. We do teach this in US history, at least at my school. In my experience, history/civics continually gets reduced in favor of STEM courses. History teachers are forced to make cuts in response. Some teachers may choose to cut Harriet, which is sad. There's definitely a lot more to Harriet Tubman than I was taught in school. She did so much for human rights. Even as an undervalued member of society at the time, she deserves to have more of her story known. Story 29. In July 1518, residents of the city in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, were struck by a sudden and seemingly uncontrollable urge to dance. The hysteria kicked off when a woman known as Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to silently twist, twirl, and shake. She kept up her solo dance-a-thon for nearly a week, and before long, some 36 others had joined in. By August, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. The strange episode didn't end until September, when the dancers were whisked away to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution. The funny thing is that there is not really an explanation for what happened. Explanations range from medical issues known as hot blood to curses being placed on people. They died of disco fever. They laid down the boogie and played that funky music till they died. Story 30. The entire life of Julie Daubigny. She was a bisexual swordmaster and heartthrob turned opera singer who lived her life entirely for the lulz, beat the crap out of dudes in sword duels, and did it topless whenever anyone doubted she was a lady. She got in trouble for making out with ladies at royal balls. She once became a nun to sleep with a nun, and then set fire to the convent. She was so wild, it's insane there's not a blockbuster movie about her. Story 31. The Killdozer. Marvin Heemeyer was a welder living in Granby, Colorado, who was upset by the local council. They had blocked his request to build a road to his muffler repair shop to go around a new factory that was being built on top of the existing road. Then they fined him for not being connected to the sewage line because a workman building the factory had cut the connection. He then bought and modified a bulldozer, giving it a 1 foot or 30 centimeter thick armor plating, 3 gun ports, 50 caliber rifles, and 308 semi-automatic rifles, and a .22 LR rifle, as well as several video cameras for him to see out of it. He then went on a rampage, damaging or knocking down 13 buildings and causing over $7 million in damage. Story 32. Zhuge Liang, a Chinese general, once stopped an invasion of 150,000 men by simply sitting atop the fortress wall strumming on a lute. The invading general saw it and pulled back. Zhuge Liang was infamous for his outside-the-box strategy, and he was absolutely convinced that the madman was baiting the incoming army into a trap. He ordered his army to retreat. The twist, Zhuge Liang had only 1,000 barely armed men to his side. To my knowledge, it was the only invasion I know of that was stopped by brass balls and BS. Zhuge Liang was a level 100 bard. You can't convince me otherwise. Story 33. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. A tank filled with 2 million gallons of molasses burst and sent a tidal wave of molasses through the streets of Boston. 21 were killed. Imagine standing in the streets as a tidal wave of molasses approaches, and just thinking to yourself, well, I guess this is how it ends. Death by molasses. Story 34. Some Soviet scientists starved to death saving the seed bank of Leningrad during Hitler's invasion in the winter of 1941 to 1942, despite it being full of corn, wheat, and potatoes. What happened? They ran out of food but couldn't eat anything from the seed bank since they needed to preserve its stocks. That level of dedication is just unimaginable. To go against your survival instincts and starve to death in order to not eat that food. I can't even comprehend. Story 35. The whole life of Miyamoto Musashi. Among other feats, he rowed a boat to a scheduled duel unarmed and whittled a wooden sword out of an oar on the way to use it as a weapon. He won. He also established a whole ryuha, school of ancient Japanese martial arts, revolving around 2 sword techniques, basically just because he got bored fighting with one. 47 Ronin is also an interesting true story. Basically, a rude nobleman aggravated a young daimyo to assault him, leading the daimyo to be forced to commit seppuku, and 47 of the daimyo's now leaderless samurai planned to avenge him. They seemingly disbanded, and some even pretended to fall to alcoholism for years so that the nobleman wouldn't expect an attack. Then they attacked. Nobody came to help the nobleman because everyone thought he sucked. Story 36. The Great Emu War. During the Great Depression, Australia was having a famine, and most of its citizens were farmers. If that wasn't bad enough, emus, basically smaller ostriches, began eating crops. The farmers then called for the military to kill the birds, and the military accepted. They were sent to kill 20,000 birds, but they only killed about 1,000. So Australia lost a war against emus. It's not every day you hear about an army losing a battle against birds that can't even fly. Maybe they should have tried negotiating with the emus instead of fighting them. Story 37. I host a podcast on strange places. This was one of the strangest. The tiny Pacific island of Nauru in the 1970s had recently become independent and decided to nationalize and profit from the enormous phosphate deposits on the island. As the income began to swell rapidly, Nauru soon had one of the world's fastest growing economies, and the government decided to invest this extra income into ensuring the health and prosperity of its citizens. In 1975, its peak year of trade, it amassed profits that would today amount to $2.5 billion, enough to secure Nauru's future for generations. The government created a sovereign wealth fund where money could be invested to generate income at a steady rate, as Norway and many other mineral-rich nations have done. However, they didn't have much experience managing wealth, and outside consultants took advantage of the tiny nation to embezzle and defund them. They also made some truly spectacularly bad investment decisions, my favorite of which was a West End musical about the love life of Leonardo da Vinci named Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love. The production was so bad that by the end of its first screening, most of the audience had left the theater. It closed a few weeks later and lost the country millions. In the end, pretty much all of Nauru's wealth was squandered through poor investment decisions and corruption and embezzlement. They turned to money laundering and have since become an island that Australia uses to house asylum seekers. It's a sad story, but it is basically a story of a person who wins the lottery and manages to lose all of his winnings, except on an international scale. Story 38. Once upon a time, the ruler of this one country was known to be something of a genocidal madman who partook in numerous potentially lethal duels without injury. One fine day, someone takes it upon themselves to kill this ruler using 2 single-shot pistols. When he approached this ruler, both pistols failed to fire in the moment of truth. The ruler then proceeded to take his cane and personally beat his would-be assassin half to death before being pulled away. Following the attempted assassination, the pistols were examined and found to be in perfect working order. Dry powder, properly loaded shot, working hammer. Thus, this is the strange tale of Andrew Jackson's failed assassination. There is only one logical explanation. The guns were afraid of him. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you have a similar story that you would like to share with us, please leave it down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. For more videos just like this one right now, please stop by our channel or click one of the ones on the video screen. Thanks again, and see you next time!